At our wedding altar, the Supreme Alpha whispered his cruelest secret. Every time I kissed you, I was thinking of her. He expected me to shatter. Instead, I wiped his kiss from my lips in front of the entire court, walked into the freezing blizzard. Welcome to Luna's Secret Library. On this channel, you can enjoy all sorts of romantic love stories. If you like my stories, please subscribe to my channel for more wonderful tales. The corset was so tight I could barely draw breath. My mother's trembling hands adjusted the lace veil over my face. She didn't look at my eyes, she looked at the heavy gold necklace around my throat. It was a beautiful leash, a gift from the man who had bought my family's survival. Outside the cathedral, the Victorian wind howled like a wounded wolf. Snow brushed against the stained glass, blurring the world into shades of grey. I was 21, blooming with the curves of youth and the despair of a prisoner. The heavy oak doors groaned open, revealing the long, cold aisle. At the end of it stood Dante, the Alpha of the Northern Territories. He was a mountain of a man, his dark hair cut short and sharp. His suit was blacker than a moonless night, clinging to his powerful, muscular frame. As I walked toward him, the silence of the 100 guests felt like a physical weight. They weren't here for love, they were here to see the sacrificial lamb. Dante didn't smile when I reached the altar. His eyes were like flint, cold and unyielding, staring straight through me. The priest began the ancient rite, his voice echoing in the hollow stone chamber. I felt the heat radiating from Dante's body, a raw, alpha energy that made my skin crawl. He took my hand, his grip firm and possessive, reminding me I was now his property. The words of the oath were ashes in my mouth as I repeated them. I promised to honor him, to obey him, to bear his mark. Then came the moment the crowd had been waiting for. You may seal this union with a kiss, the priest declared. Dante stepped closer, his shadow engulfing my smaller, softer form. He tilted my chin up with a gloved finger, forcing my gaze to meet his. For a heartbeat, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not desire, but a haunting grief. His lips pressed against mine, hard and demanding. It should have been a beginning, a spark of hope in a dark world. But as he pulled back just an inch, his breath fanned against my ear. His voice was a low, jagged whisper that shattered my soul. Every time I kissed you, I was thinking of her, he said. The world went silent, the blood in my veins turning to ice. The her he meant was the woman he truly loved, the one I could never replace. I looked at the man I had just given my life to, and I saw a monster. The guests began to clap, oblivious to the murder of my heart. Dante went to turn away, his duty done, his dominance established. But I didn't let go of his hand. I reached up, my fingers trembling but certain. With the back of my hand, I wiped my lips with a slow, deliberate motion. I did it in front of the dukes, the lords, and the gossiping ladies of the court. I did it until my skin was red and the taste of him was gone. Dante froze, his alpha aura flaring in a dangerous, silent warning. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice as cold as the blizzard outside. Never again, I whispered, loud enough for the front row to gasp. I didn't wait for his reaction or the priest's blessing. I tore the heavy lace veil from my head and let it fall to the dusty floor. The heavy gold necklace followed, hitting the stone with a dull, metallic thud. I turned my back on the alpha, on the altar, and on the life of a pawn. I walked down the aisle, my head held high, my curvy silhouette defiant against the light. The doors swung open, and I stepped out into the freezing winter night. The cold felt like freedom, biting and honest compared to his touch. Behind me, the cathedral erupted into a roar of confusion and alpha rage. But I didn't look back. I was no longer Aliona the bride, I was Aliona the ghost. And ghosts have nothing left to lose. The snow began to cover my tracks as I disappeared into the dark. I had no money, no home, and no protector. But I had my pride, and for the first time in my life, I had my soul. Dante thought he could use me to fill a void in his heart. He was wrong. I would rather freeze in the wild than burn in his lie. This was the end of the girl who obeyed. This was the birth of the woman who would make him regret every word. The rebellion had begun. The winter air was a jagged blade, cutting through the thin silk of my wedding skirts. Every step into the deep snow felt like sinking into a grave of white powder. Behind me, the lights of the northern citadel were fading, swallowed by the swirling grey mist. I didn't have a cloak, a map, or a single coin in my pocket. But I had the taste of my own blood on my tongue, and it tasted like victory. My mother had once told me that an alpha's love is a sun, but his hate is a permafrost. Dante had tried to freeze my soul with 10 simple, cruel words. Every time I kissed you, I was thinking of her. I repeated the words in my head, using the anger to spark a fire in my freezing veins. If I died out here, I would die as Eliana, not as a shadow of a dead woman. The forest groaned around me, the ancient pines buckling under the weight of the Victorian storm. My lungs burned with every breath, the oxygen so cold it felt like inhaling needles. I stumbled over a buried root, my curvy frame hitting the drifts with a muffled thud. For a heartbeat, I wanted to stay there, to let the silence take me. It would be so easy to close my eyes and let the snow become my final wedding veil. Then, I remembered the way Dante had tilted my chin, his eyes full of a ghost that wasn't me. I forced my numb fingers into the snow and pushed myself up. Not today, I whispered, the words cracking like dry ice. I saw a dark shape through the trees, a slumped roof, a stone chimney, a fragment of hope. It was an old hunter's shack, abandoned before I was even born. The door hung on a rusted hinge, complaining as I forced my way into the shadows. It smelled of wet earth and old, forgotten winters. I didn't cry, tears would only freeze on my cheeks and steal more of my heat. I found a pile of dry pine needles in the corner, my father's lessons echoing in my mind. He was a man of the earth, a healer who knew that survival is a series of small, calculated acts. I used a piece of flint from the hearth, striking it until my knuckles bled. A tiny spark caught, a golden eye opening in the darkness of the shack. I fed it with scraps of my silk train, watching the fabric that cost a fortune turn into heat. The fire grew, casting dancing shadows against the rough-hewn wooden walls. I took off my boots, my feet white and senseless, and held them toward the light. The pain of returning warmth was 1,000 stings, a scream I buried in my throat. I was 21, beautiful, and supposed to be a queen in a gilded palace tonight. Instead, I was a refugee in a shack, sewing the cuts on my feet with a needle made of bone. Across the valley, in the center of the citadel, the Alpha was roaring. Dante stood in the empty cathedral, his short hair messy and his eyes glowing with a dangerous gold. The guests had been ushered out, leaving only the smell of extinguished candles and scandal. He picked up the gold necklace I had dropped, the metal still warm from my skin. His wolf was pacing inside him, a low, frantic growl vibrating in his massive chest. He had expected me to weep, to cling to his boots and beg for a scrap of his heart. He had never considered the possibility that a substitute could have a spine of steel. Find her, he barked at his commanders, his voice a thunderclap that shook the stone walls. The storm will kill her in an hour, my lord, the captain whispered, trembling. Dante turned on him, his alpha aura flaring so bright the captain fell to his knees. Then find her body, Dante hissed, though something in his chest felt like it was breaking. He walked to the large stained glass window, looking out at the wall of white. He touched his lips, the place where he had tried to plant a lie. He could still feel the phantom sensation of her hand wiping the kiss away. It was the first time in his life an Omega had looked at him with nothing but disgust. He had spent years trying to find a face that looked like his lost love. Now, he realized he couldn't even remember the color of the other woman's eyes. All he could see was Aliona, her curvy silhouette disappearing into the dark. She hadn't just left the wedding, she had stolen his peace of mind. I sat by my small fire, the silk bandages tight around my feet. The wind howled outside, but for the first time, the sound didn't scare me. I looked at my reflection in a shard of broken glass I found on the floor. My hair was a mess, my skin was pale, but my eyes were blazing. I wasn't the girl Dante bought to be a puppet. I was the woman who would burn his world down to stay warm. The Alpha thought he was the hunter, but he had no idea what I was capable of. As the moon rose behind the clouds, I felt a strange pulse in my blood. It was a hidden legacy, a power my father had kept secret from the High Lords. I closed my eyes and felt the forest breathing with me. The hunt had begun, but I was no longer the prey. The shack was no longer a tomb, it was a cocoon. The hidden legacy in my blood began to sing a forgotten song in the dark. I pressed my cold palm against the frost-covered wooden floorboards. Beneath the rotting planks, a dormant root pulsed with sudden, violent life. My father had always told me that true strength wasn't found in a drawn sword. True strength was the ability to coax aggressive life from the very edge of death. I walked to the shattered doorway, my curvy frame moving with a new, fluid grace. The winter storm screamed at my face, but I did not shiver or look away. I closed my eyes and pushed the rhythm of my heartbeat down into the frozen earth. Green light, raw and ancient, spilled from my trembling fingertips into the snow. Massive vines, thick as a man's arm and covered in silver thorns, erupted from the ground. They coiled rapidly around the shack, weaving a dense, impenetrable fortress of briars. The thorny wall climbed higher and higher, shutting out the howling wind and the biting cold. I was Aliona, the discarded bride, and I was claiming this small piece of hell as my kingdom. I watched a single white winter rose bloom right at the center of the thorny gate. It was a symbol of my survival, beautiful, resilient, and utterly untouched by his poison. Miles away, the Alpha was tearing the winter forest apart. Dante rode his massive black stallion through the blizzard, pushing his elite trackers to the brink. His short, dark hair was plastered to his forehead by the freezing, relentless sleet. His incredibly handsome, sculpted face was a mask of cold fury and a rising, terrifying panic. He was a warrior of lethal, athletic power, moving without the clumsy bulk of lesser men. But all his unmatched physical strength was useless against the crushing, empty weight in his chest. He could still feel the phantom warmth of my curvy body slipping away from his arrogant grasp. The scent of my blood on the snow hit the trackers like a physical blow. "She went this way, my lord," the lead tracker shouted over the roaring wind. Dante kicked his horse forward, his golden eyes burning holes into the stormy night. He expected to find a frozen corpse, a tragic mistake he could bury and forget. Instead, his horse reared up in terror as they broke through the tree line. Before them stood a towering dome of writhing, living green thorns in the middle of winter. The wild magic radiating from the vines clashed violently with Dante's aggressive alpha pheromones. The forest itself recognized him as a threat to its newly crowned mistress. Without warning, the silver thorns whipped out like angry serpents. They lashed at the elite trackers, disarming them and stringing them up by their boots. Dante leaped from his horse, his boots hitting the snow with a heavy, dangerous thud. He drew his silver sword, his heart pounding not with battle lust, but with a desperate yearning. He slashed at a thick vine, cutting it cleanly in two. But before the severed piece even hit the ground, two new thorny branches sprouted to replace it. The plants were feeding on his aggression, turning his alpha dominance against him. He pushed forward, ignoring the thorns tearing at his black suit and scratching his flawless face. Then, the living wall parted just enough for him to see inside the sanctuary. I stood by the glowing hearth, my silhouette framed by the twisting green magic. I didn't look like the terrified, debt-ridden bride he had humiliated at the altar. I met his frantic golden gaze, my own eyes completely devoid of love, fear, or submission. I raised a single hand, pointing a finger straight at his chest. The vines slammed shut with a deafening crack, forming a solid, physical wall between us. The sheer force of the magic threw Dante backward into the deep snow. He lay there for a moment, defeated not by an invading army, but by the woman he threw away. His elite guards stared in absolute horror as their invincible alpha slowly stood up. He didn't roar, he didn't order another attack. He just stared at the impenetrable wall of thorns, a drop of blood sliding down his handsome cheek. He realized the horrific, beautiful truth of what he had done. He hadn't just lost a convenient substitute for his imaginary white oak. He had awakened a queen who would never, ever bow to him again. The agonizing fire of the crematorium had officially been lit in his chest. The storm finally broke at dawn, leaving behind a world of blinding white and deadly silence. My sanctuary of thorns had kept me alive, but I knew it couldn't keep me hidden forever. Before I left the forest, I stood before the wall of vines, silently thanking the earth for its violent protection. I spent 3 days learning the rhythm of my new bloodline, coaxing rare, potent herbs from the frozen ground. With my velvet wedding gown torn and repurposed into a heavy, dark cloak, I carefully disguised my curvy silhouette. I left the briar patch behind, carrying a satchel full of emerald leaves that pulsed with deep healing magic. The nearest settlement was Ashvale, a lawless trading town perched precariously on the edge of the neutral territories. It was a place where desperate people went to disappear, and I was currently the most desperate of them all. The journey was grueling, the freezing wind tearing at my makeshift cloak and biting my pale face. Every step away from his territory was a victory, a silent rebellion against the tragic fate he had written for me. I arrived in Ashvale with blistered feet and an empty stomach, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in years. The town smelled of cheap ale, wet fur, and the desperation of outlaws seeking quick, untraceable gold. No one cared about my past, and no one asked why a young, beautiful woman was traveling entirely alone. I rented a small, damp corner in the back of a bustling tavern, trading a single glowing root for a week's stay. I didn't offer my real name, I simply became known to the locals as the quiet woman with the green touch. My first patient was a gruff lumberjack with a severed artery, a fatal wound that should have killed him in minutes. I pressed my hands over his bleeding flesh, letting the warm, golden light of my magic knit his skin back together. The tavern went dead silent as the man stood up, completely healed, staring at me as if I were a descending goddess. Word of the miraculous healer spread through the dirty cobblestone streets like wildfire in a dry forest. Silver and gold coins finally began to fill my empty pockets, giving me the one thing Dante had always denied me: total independence. A wealthy merchant, dying of a rare blood rot, was soon brought to my tavern corner on a makeshift stretcher. His desperate family offered me a chest of jewels if I could do what the expensive city doctors could not. I channeled the ancient life force of the forest, pulling the black poison from his veins with my bare hands. The sheer display of raw, miraculous healing solidified my unshakable reputation as the untouchable saint of Ashvale. I used the merchant's jewels to buy information, quietly setting up a network of spies among the street urchins. I needed to know exactly what the Northern Alpha was doing, so I could stay 5 steps ahead of his wrath. Hundreds of miles away, the citadel of the North felt like a sprawling, suffocating icy tomb. Dante stood in his grand war room, his sculpted, handsome face drawn and unusually pale with sheer exhaustion. His short, dark hair was heavily disheveled, and his athletic, muscular frame was tight with suppressed, violent anxiety. He had not slept a single hour since the night of the wedding, haunted by the memory of my hand wiping away his kiss. He smashed a heavy crystal glass against the stone wall, the shattering sound echoing through the terrified silence of his generals. "You are telling me that a single, unescorted woman has vanished into thin air," he roared, his alpha aura suffocating the room. His elite spies lowered their heads, absolutely unable to look their formidable, furious leader in the eye. He slammed a heavy velvet bag of gold onto the grand mahogany war table. 1,000,000 gold pieces to the man who brings her back to me, completely unharmed, Dante commanded, his voice trembling with a dark obsession. He didn't care about the political fallout or the rumors whispering that the great, stoic alpha had finally gone mad. He only knew that the phantom scent of my skin was driving his inner wolf into a state of rabid, uncontrollable frenzy. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that I was never just a convenient substitute. The woman he had mourned for years was just a child's memory, a faded painting that held no real warmth or fire. It was me, Aliona, with my defiant eyes and resilient, curvy grace, that he truly craved with every fiber of his being. He had foolishly thrown a diamond into the dirt just to chase a blurry reflection in a puddle. "Send the shadow hounds to the neutral borders," Dante whispered, his golden eyes flashing with a dangerous, absolute resolve. Back in Ashvale, I wiped the sweat from my brow, counting my earnings under the dim flicker of a tallow candle. I finally had enough gold to buy a modest horse and secure safe passage on a merchant ship heading far south. I was so close to being completely free from his shadow. But as I stepped out into the cold night air to fetch water, a strange, terrifying chill ran down my spine. The noisy tavern behind me suddenly felt miles away, the ambient sound entirely swallowed by an unnatural silence. A massive shadow detached itself from the alleyway, its eyes glowing with a faint, predatory amber light. It wasn't a normal wolf, it was a shadow hound, a rare beast bred exclusively by the royal kennels of the northern citadel. It didn't attack, it merely sat on the snow, staring at me, its nose twitching as it locked onto my unique scent. Dante's reach was far longer and darker than I had ever dared to imagine. I didn't scream or run, knowing perfectly well that fear would only trigger the supernatural beast's hunting instinct. I calmly reached into my satchel, my steady fingers closing around a handful of sleep-inducing spore pods. The beast let out a low, mournful howl, a magical signal that would echo across the ley line straight to Dante's mind. I crushed the spore pods in my hand, blowing the shimmering, potent dust directly into the hound's glowing eyes. The massive creature whimpered, its legs buckling instantly before it collapsed into a deep, magical slumber. If the alpha wanted a war, I was no longer the helpless bride who would surrender without a fight. The beacon had been lit, and Dante now knew my exact coordinates. I gathered my gold, my rare herbs, and my newly forged iron dagger, stepping gracefully over the sleeping beast. He thought he had finally cornered me, but he was about to discover exactly what kind of monster he had created. The freezing wind of Ashvale whipped furiously against my heavy dark cloak as I rode my newly purchased horse toward the southern border. I had left the massive, sleeping shadowhound behind in the dirty alleyway, a silent, magical monument to my absolute defiance. Every desperate gallop of the terrified horse carried me further away from the northern citadel and the alpha who had shattered my trust. I was no longer the frightened, deeply indebted bride who had stood trembling in her tight corset at the winter altar. I was Aliona, a wandering healer with potent magic humming in my veins, a resilient woman who had carved her own survival out of the deadly ice. The neutral border of the wildlands was only a mile away, clearly marked by a jagged line of ancient, twisted ironwood trees. If I managed to cross that sacred line, Dante's legal authority and territorial dominance over me would dissolve instantly into the freezing mist. But as I approached the dark edge of the tree line, the ambient temperature suddenly plummeted to an unnatural, bone-chilling degree. My horse let out a high, terrified whinny, violently rearing up as a suffocating wave of aggressive alpha pheromones flooded the narrow, snowy path. I didn't even need to see his face to know he was there. My traitorous blood immediately recognized the terrifying, magnetic pull of my former mate. A massive, midnight black stallion stepped slowly and deliberately out of the dense shadows, completely blocking the only road to my freedom. Atop the imposing beast sat Dante, the supreme alpha of the north, looking like a dark god of vengeance and desperate, starving longing. His short, dark hair was wildly windblown, framing a flawlessly sculpted, deeply athletic face that was now uncharacteristically pale with sheer exhaustion. He didn't wear his heavy, intimidating battle armor, but his tailored black winter coat clung perfectly to his lean, incredibly muscular frame. He was absolutely not the bulky, lumbering monster I had sometimes imagined in my nightmares. He was a lethal, graceful predator of unparalleled beauty. But the piercing golden eyes that locked onto mine were completely devoid of the arrogant, icy pride I vividly remembered from our disastrous wedding day. Instead, they were burning with a frantic, almost feverish obsession, entirely stripped of their usual cold, calculating indifference. "You made it much further than I ever thought possible," his incredibly deep voice rumbled, vibrating through the frigid air and settling heavily in my chest. I ruthlessly tightened my grip on the worn leather reins, absolutely refusing to let him see the slight, betraying tremble in my cold hands. "And you traveled a ridiculously long way just to harass a woman you explicitly stated you do not even want," I shot back, my voice as hard and sharp as flint. Dante violently flinched, the subtle, uncontrollable movement betraying the immense, raw pain my razor-sharp words inflicted upon his fragile pride. He dismounted his horse with terrifying grace, his heavy leather boots sinking deep into the fresh snow as he took a slow, deliberate step toward me. "I was a blind, arrogant fool, Aliona," he rasped, the desperate confession sounding exactly like it was physically tearing his throat apart from the inside. He looked up at my face, frantically tracing the resilient lines of my jaw and the lush, curvy silhouette carefully hidden beneath my heavy cloak. I foolishly chased a fading ghost for years, completely blind to the living, breathing miracle standing right in front of me. I let out a harsh, incredibly bitter laugh that loudly echoed through the silent, frozen expanse of the ancient forest. "Do not try to rewrite our pathetic history just because your favorite, obedient toy suddenly decided to walk away," I sneered, fiercely holding my ground. "Every time you kissed me, you thought of her," I repeated his own venomous words slowly, using them as an impenetrable, iron shield against his sudden vulnerability. The powerful alpha closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a naked expression of pure, unadulterated agony violently twisting his exceptionally handsome features. "I lied," he whispered hoarsely, opening his golden eyes to reveal a fractured soul entirely consumed by a fiery, devastating sea of regret. "I said it solely to hurt you, to aggressively protect myself from the terrifying realization that you were rapidly replacing her in my cold heart." He took another reckless step forward, raising an ungloved, trembling hand as if he desperately wanted to reach out and touch my pale cheek. I didn't back away. Instead, I firmly planted my boots in the stirrups and let the ancient, dormant magic of the earth rise up from the soil. A thick, glowing green barrier of massive thorny vines violently erupted from the snow, snapping like lethal whips in the narrow space between us. Dante completely froze in his tracks, his golden eyes widening in absolute shock as he stared at the lethal, magical briars fiercely protecting me. He had fully expected to confront a weeping, terrified girl, but he instead found a powerful, untamed force of nature commanding the forest itself. "If you take one more step toward me, Alpha, these thorns will mercilessly tear you apart," I warned, my own eyes brightly glowing with emerald, supernatural light. The absolute most powerful man in the entire Northern Territory stood utterly paralyzed, not by the ancient magic, but by the impenetrable, solid wall of my absolute hatred. He realized in that profoundly devastating moment that all his vast wealth, his massive armies, and his lethal physical strength meant absolutely nothing here. He could easily conquer 100 heavily fortified cities, but he absolutely could not force my wounded heart to ever open for him again. "Please, come back to the citadel with me," he pleaded, the pathetic, broken words sounding entirely alien coming from the proud lips of a supreme alpha. "I will gladly give you absolutely everything, my vast wealth, my absolute loyalty, my entire life, just to see you smile. I looked down at his handsome, broken face from my horse, feeling nothing but a profound, liberating, and absolute emptiness in my chest. I already have absolutely everything I could ever need, I replied coldly, deliberately pulling the heavy hood of my dark cloak over my head. And absolutely none of it belongs to you, Dante. I confidently urged my horse forward, seamlessly steering it off the main traveled path and directly into the dense, completely untamed wilderness. The magical, glowing vines seamlessly parted to let me safely through, then violently slammed shut, completely and permanently blocking Dante's desperate pursuit. I didn't bother to look back to see the utterly broken Alpha falling heavily to his knees in the unforgiving, freezing snow. The dangerous chase was still far from over, but the fundamental balance of power had permanently, irrevocably shifted in my favor. I had successfully crossed the neutral border, confidently leaving the bitter ashes of our ruined, fake marriage far behind in the howling winter wind. Now, the real, high-stakes game of survival and empire building would officially begin, and it would happen entirely on my own terms. The Alpha thought he knew the meaning of pain, but the crematorium he had built for himself was only just beginning to burn. 6 months passed, turning the freezing northern winter into a scorching southern summer. I didn't just survive in the neutral, bustling free city of Sunforge, I completely conquered it. Using my potent healing magic and the gold I earned in Ashvale, I built the Emerald Sanctuary. It was now the largest medical and trading guild in the neutral territories, and I was its undisputed master. I had traded my heavy, dark travel cloak for elegant, tailored silk gowns that perfectly accentuated my curvy figure. I was no longer the naive, debt-ridden noble girl shivering in a tight corset at a winter altar. I was a queen in my own right, commanding fleets of merchant ships and an army of loyal mercenaries. But absolute power always comes with a heavy, inescapable price. A terrifying, magical plague known as the blood rust began to rapidly sweep through the southern slums. My healing magic could soothe the agonizing symptoms, but it could not permanently cure the dark infection. To save my city, I desperately needed the tears of a silver leviathan, an incredibly rare beast only found in the frozen northern oceans. I was preparing to bankrupt my entire guild to hire smugglers when my heavily armed guards nervously parted in the courtyard. Dante walked slowly through the massive iron gates of my sunlit sanctuary. He didn't bring his intimidating army, his royal banners, or his suffocating alpha dominance. He wore a simple, travel-stained dark tunic, looking more like a weary mercenary than the supreme lord of the north. His incredibly handsome face was thinner, sharply carved by months of relentless, silent suffering. His dark, short hair was slightly overgrown, and his golden eyes held none of the terrifying fire I remembered. Instead, they were filled with a profound, quiet reverence as he looked at the powerful woman I had become. He didn't demand an audience, nor did he try to violently breach my magical defenses. He simply stopped at the bottom of the marble steps, slowly sinking to one knee in front of my entire guild. The collective gasp of my hardened mercenaries echoed loudly in the warm summer air. The proudest, most lethal alpha on the continent was publicly bowing to a rogue healer. He carefully placed a massive, glowing crystal chest on the sun-baked cobblestones. I heard the free city was in desperate need of northern medicine, his deep, rumbling voice echoed softly. Inside the magical chest were enough silver leviathan tears to cure every single infected citizen 10 times over. What is the price for this, Dante? I asked coldly, my emerald eyes narrowing with deep suspicion. He slowly looked up at me, his gaze completely stripped of all arrogance, leaving only a raw, bleeding devotion. There is absolutely no price, Aliona, he answered, his voice cracking slightly under the immense weight of his regret. I am not here to buy you, command you, or trick you into coming back to my frozen hell. I am simply here to serve the woman who rightfully holds my entire soul in her hands. He stood up gracefully, leaving the priceless treasure at my feet, and actually turned to walk away. The invincible alpha was finally learning that true love meant giving absolutely everything while expecting nothing in return. The glowing Leviathan tears were a flawless, potent miracle that successfully brought the sprawling slums back from the brink of absolute death. I worked tirelessly for 3 days and 3 nights without a single moment of sleep, my healing magic completely and utterly exhausted. Dante stayed quietly in the outer courtyard the entire time, his athletic frame standing guard like a silent, unbreakable stone gargoyle. His short, dark hair was constantly whipped by the wind, but he never once stepped inside to demand my precious time or attention. He simply and ruthlessly slaughtered any desperate looters or rogue mercenaries who foolishly tried to breach the heavy iron gates. On the 4th morning, the heavy, dark clouds finally parted, and the infected citizens of the free city began to breathe easily once more. I stood completely alone in the center of the sunlit sanctuary courtyard, my curvy body swaying dangerously from sheer, bone-deep magical exhaustion. But the terrifying magical plague was never just a random natural disaster, it was a carefully orchestrated, deadly political trap. The precise moment my magical reserves hit their absolute lowest, the stone courtyard violently exploded in a burst of dark, blinding purple energy. 5 elite assassins of the Shadow Syndicate instantly materialized from the toxic smoke, their faces completely hidden behind terrifying silver masks. They had been secretly hired by the corrupt northern lords who deeply feared my rapidly growing, independent power in the neutral territories. I weakly raised my trembling hands to summon my protective thorns, but a heavy, enchanted net of anti-magic iron was brutally thrown over my shoulders. The cursed, freezing metal burned my pale skin, instantly suppressing the ancient green magic that usually hummed in my exhausted veins. I was violently pulled to my knees on the shattered cobblestones, completely and terrifyingly defenseless for the first time in 6 long months. The lead assassin raised a jagged, obsidian dagger dripping with potent, highly concentrated basilisk venom, aiming straight for my beating heart. I closed my emerald eyes, fiercely refusing to give my cowardly murderers the twisted satisfaction of ever seeing my fear. But the fatal, descending strike never touched my skin. A terrifying, earth-shattering roar of pure, untamed alpha rage violently shook the very magical foundations of the Emerald Sanctuary. Dante moved significantly faster than humanly possible, becoming an explosive blur of raw, lethal power and desperate, frantic devotion. He absolutely didn't have the precious milliseconds required to draw his silver sword or summon his elite royal guards from the city perimeter. He simply threw his muscular, perfectly sculpted body directly between my fragile, bound form and the descending, poisoned blade. The sickening, horrific sound of tearing flesh and shattering bone echoed incredibly loudly in the sudden, terrifying silence of the courtyard. I snapped my eyes open in pure shock to see the jagged assassin's dagger completely impaling Dante's broad, powerful chest. Black, highly toxic venom immediately began to spread through his veins, violently clashing with his dominant, fiercely protective alpha blood. He didn't scream, and he didn't collapse. He just reached out with blinding speed and brutally snapped the lead assassin's neck with one bare hand. The remaining 4 assassins froze in absolute, paralyzing terror as the Supreme Lord of the North turned his glowing, furious golden eyes on them. Even with a fatal, cursed blade buried deep in his heart, his suffocating aura was enough to make the seasoned killers drop their weapons and flee. As the immediate threat cowardly vanished into the shadows, the supernatural adrenaline keeping the alpha upright finally began to violently crash. Dante fell heavily to his knees, coughing up a terrifying mouthful of dark, poisoned blood directly onto the sunbaked stones. I frantically tore the anti-magic net off my shoulders, completely ignoring the severe, blistering burns on my own shaking hands. I dropped to the ground beside him, my heart pounding with a sudden, overwhelming terror I had not felt since the agonizing day of our wedding. "Why did you do that?" I screamed, my voice breaking uncontrollably as I pressed my glowing hands desperately over his massive, bleeding wound. He looked up at me, his exceptionally handsome, deeply contoured face rapidly losing its color, but his golden eyes were startlingly calm and infinitely tender. His short hair was matted with cold sweat and dust, completely stripping away the flawless, untouchable image of a ruling monarch. Because a world without you, Aliona, is a cold, dead world I absolutely refuse to live in, he whispered, his incredibly deep voice weak but unwavering. He didn't desperately ask for my forgiveness, and he didn't selfishly beg for my miraculous healing magic to save his rapidly fading life. He simply lifted his trembling, blood-stained hand, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray tear away from my pale, beautiful cheek. He had once cruelly told me that every single time he kissed me, he was blindly thinking of a ghost from his past. But now, as he bled out on the cold stones of my sanctuary, I knew with absolute certainty that he was finally seeing only me. The supreme, unconquerable Alpha was dying right at my feet, and the terrifying, undeniable truth was that I couldn't bear to let him go. The impenetrable ice fortress I had carefully, painfully built around my wounded heart finally began to silently fracture and break into pieces. I poured every single ounce of my remaining life force into his chest, the green light violently fighting the spreading black decay. The real battle for his soul, and for my forgiveness, had just begun. The black, highly concentrated venom of the Shadow Syndicate was ancient, ruthless, and unnaturally fast. My raw emerald magic fought violently against the spreading, corrosive darkness inside his chest, but I was rapidly losing ground. Dante's breathing grew incredibly shallow, his powerful, athletic frame trembling violently on the bloody cobblestones of my courtyard. His perfectly sculpted, exceptionally handsome face was completely drained of all its vibrant life, looking like a shattered marble statue. I pushed every single ounce of my remaining energy into his gaping wound, my curvy body shuddering from the intense magical strain. But the fatal basilisk poison was specifically designed to instantly kill a supreme alpha, and it was horrifyingly succeeding. My hardened mercenaries watched in absolute, terrifying silence as the invincible Lord of the North began to slip away into the dark. I refused to let him die, not after he had just traded his entire universe to buy me a few more seconds of breath. There was only one dangerous, forbidden path left to drag his fading soul back from the icy abyss of death. My father had once warned me about the ancient blood rite, a wild magic that permanently bound two souls together in absolute equality. I pulled my small iron dagger from my belt, my pale hands trembling as I brought the incredibly sharp edge to my own palm. I sliced deep into my own flesh, wincing as a line of bright, magically charged red blood quickly welled to the surface. Without a single moment of hesitation, I pressed my bleeding hand directly over Dante's toxic, completely ruined heart. You do not get to cowardly leave this world until I explicitly give you permission, Alpha, I whispered fiercely into the silent courtyard. I violently forced my healing magic to fuse directly with my open wound, pushing my own raw life force straight into his failing veins. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive, sending a blinding shockwave of pure gold and emerald light tearing through the sanctuary. The agonizing pain was absolute torture, feeling as if liquid fire was violently burning through every single nerve in my tired body. But within that terrifying magical storm, my soul violently crashed directly into his. I was suddenly pulled into the deepest, darkest corners of his mind, seeing the profound, unbearable agony he had suffered since I left. I felt the exact, crushing weight of his monumental regret, the sleepless nights he spent silently screaming my name into the winter storm. I saw the pathetic, fading memory of the other woman completely disintegrate, entirely replaced by the brilliant, untamed fire of my own resilient spirit. He loved me with a terrifying, all-consuming devotion that was absolutely stripped of his former arrogant dominance. The black venom fiercely fought against my intrusion, desperately trying to freeze my blood and drag us both down into the dark. But I was the Queen of Sunforge, the master of resilient life, and I absolutely refused to surrender my newly claimed mate to the shadows. With a final, desperate scream of sheer willpower, I violently shattered the poisonous curse, completely flushing the dark venom from his veins. The explosive magical light slowly faded, leaving us both gasping for air on the shattered, blood-stained stones. I slumped heavily forward, my head resting exhausted against his broad, completely healed chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. The fatal wound was entirely gone, replaced by a permanent, glowing silver scar that perfectly matched the magical mark now burning on my own palm. The ancient, unbreakable soul bond had been successfully forged, but this time, there was absolutely no submission on my part. Dante slowly opened his breathtaking golden eyes, the terrifying, predatory fire completely replaced by a profound, tear-filled reverence. He didn't move to aggressively trap me in his arms, nor did he release a single trace of his suffocating alpha pheromones. Instead, he weakly lifted his large, calloused hand, trembling violently as he gently cupped the side of my pale, exhausted face. "You saved a monster, Aliona," he whispered hoarsely, a single, incredibly rare tear sliding down his flawlessly contoured cheek. I looked down at the incredibly powerful man who had finally learned to completely surrender his monumental pride. "I didn't save a monster," I replied, my voice steady and vibrating with newly forged, absolute authority. "I simply claimed what is now rightfully mine." Dante let out a breathless, shuddering laugh, carefully turning his head to press a deeply reverent kiss into my wounded palm. "Forever," he vowed, his deep voice carrying the absolute, unshakable weight of a completely broken man who had finally found his true religion. The bitter, suffocating ashes of the crematorium had finally been washed away by the blood of a true, equal sacrifice. The Alpha of the North belonged entirely to the healer of the South, and the entire continent would soon tremble at our combined power. The brutal, howling wind of the Northern Territories whipped violently against my face, cold and unforgiving just as I remembered it. It was the exact same bitter winter storm that had desperately tried to bury me alive on the tragic night of my disastrous wedding. But absolutely everything else about this frozen, desolate landscape had been permanently and irrevocably altered by my own hands. I was no longer the terrified, debt-ridden noble girl who had shivered uncontrollably beneath a suffocating veil of delicate lace. I was no longer violently squeezed into a cruel corset that stole my breath and ruthlessly crushed my youthful, vibrant spirit. My curvy, resilient silhouette was now proudly draped in heavy emerald velvet that flowed around me like a river of living magic. Thick, impenetrable northern wool fur rested comfortably on my shoulders, shielding me from the biting frost of the high mountains. I rode a magnificent white warhorse, its hooves striking the frozen earth with a steady, unstoppable rhythm that echoed my own heartbeat. Beside me rode Dante, the formidable, once terrifying alpha who had mercilessly broken my heart with a single, devastating sentence. He sat atop his massive, midnight black stallion, moving with the lethal, athletic grace of an apex predator completely at peace. His short, dark hair was continuously blown wildly in the biting blizzard, framing a flawlessly sculpted, incredibly handsome face. He was a man of breathtaking, three-dimensional beauty, exuding a raw, masculine power that was entirely free of any clumsy, monstrous bulk. He no longer wore the heavy, intimidating battle armor that had made him look like an untouchable god of war and vengeance. Instead, a simple, tailored black leather tunic clung tightly to his lean, deeply muscular chest, exposing the collar of his neck to the cold. Beneath that dark leather, right over his powerful heart, burned the permanent, glowing silver scar of his ultimate, bloody sacrifice. It was a constant, beautiful reminder of the terrible day he had willingly thrown his life away just to buy me another breath. His piercing golden eyes, which had once looked at me with such arrogant, icy indifference, were now constantly fixed upon my face. They held none of the terrifying, dominant fire I remembered from the altar, replaced entirely by a profound, quiet, and absolute reverence. He was a lethal, incredibly athletic weapon of mass destruction, and the invisible hilt of his sword now belonged entirely to me. We slowly approached the towering, black stone gates of the ancient citadel, the imposing fortress that had loomed over my worst nightmares. The massive, jagged walls of the castle seemed to scrape the grey, weeping sky, standing as a dark monument to centuries of Alpha tyranny. In the past, merely looking at these oppressive stone towers would have sent a paralyzing wave of pure dread straight down my spine. But today, the ancient, potent green magic humming fiercely in my warm veins easily pushed away any lingering shadows of my trauma. I confidently commanded my horse to stop right before the massive, iron-reinforced gates, taking a deep, cleansing breath of the icy air. Inside the grand, echoing chambers of the citadel's great hall, the corrupt, treacherous northern lords were currently celebrating. They foolishly believed that the potent, highly concentrated basilisk venom of the Shadow Syndicate had successfully murdered their alpha. They were eagerly, greedily, and loudly dividing his vast territories, his immense wealth, and his absolute military power among themselves. I could faintly hear the sickening sounds of their arrogant laughter and clinking goblets echoing through the thick, frozen courtyard walls. They thought the Northern Empire was finally theirs to tear apart like a pack of starving, treacherous scavengers descending on a corpse. Dante calmly dismounted his massive stallion, his heavy leather boots sinking deep into the fresh, undisturbed snow with a terrifying silence. He didn't draw his legendary silver sword, nor did he bark orders to any of the terrified, trembling perimeter guards who had spotted us. He simply walked up to the towering, impossibly heavy oak doors that sealed the great hall and placed his large, calloused palms against them. The deafening, joyful noise of the traitor's treason instantly died when the massive, ancient oak doors were violently blasted inward. The heavy, splintered wood violently crashed onto the cold stone floor, raising a thick, terrifying cloud of winter dust, shattered ice, and snow. The deafening explosion shook the very magical foundations of the citadel, rattling the stained glass windows until they threatened to break. I gracefully dismounted my horse, my emerald velvet gown sweeping majestically over the snow as I confidently stepped through the shattered entrance. The heavy winter dust slowly began to settle, revealing the absolutely horrified faces of the 50 corrupt lords gathered in the hall. Their greedy faces completely drained of all blood, turning a sickly shade of pale grey as they stared at the impossible sight before them. They were staring in absolute, paralyzing horror at the dead man walking, the invincible alpha they had so cowardly paid to assassinate. Dante stepped through the destroyed doorway exactly half a step behind me, ensuring he never once blocked my path or overshadowed my presence. His terrifying, suffocating alpha aura instantly blanketed the entire freezing room in a thick, physical wave of pure, unadulterated dread. You cowardly, pathetic rats actually dared to send assassins into my wife's sanctuary, Dante's incredibly deep voice softly rumbled. His tone wasn't a roar, but the lethal, quiet promise of absolute destruction that instantly brought several weaker lords to their trembling knees. The lead conspirator, a trembling, aging duke who had always hated my presence, desperately drew his heavy broadsword in a panic. He lunged violently toward my seemingly unprotected back in a final, suicidal act of madness, screaming a desperate battle cry. He absolutely never even made it past the second marble step leading up to the elevated platform of the throne. Dante moved with blinding, supernatural speed, his heavily muscled, athletic frame becoming a terrifying blur of pure, protective rage. He effortlessly bypassed the swinging blade, catching the treacherous duke by his thick throat with a single, brutally strong hand. He lifted the heavy, armored grown man completely off the cold stone floor, the duke's boots kicking helplessly in the empty air. Absolutely no one touches the Queen of Sunforge, Dante snarled, his golden eyes flashing with a violent, predatory light that promised agony. He was fully prepared to crush the traitor's windpipe into dust, to paint the walls of his ancestral hall with the blood of the men who hurt me. But I gracefully raised my glowing right hand, the silver scar on my palm flashing brilliantly in the dim, torchlit room. I utterly refused to let my fiercely loyal mate shed any more unnecessary blood on this profoundly historic and sacred day. Enough, I commanded softly, my steady, melodic voice easily piercing through the terrifying, violent tension of the silent great hall. Dante instantly froze mid-strike, completely halting his lethal momentum in a display of impossible, absolute physical control. He obediently tossed the gasping, terrified Duke to the floor, stepping back immediately and lowering his handsome head. It was an act of absolute, unquestioning submission to my single word, performed in front of the entire, stunned northern court. The remaining corrupt lords fell heavily to their knees, absolutely terrified by the mind-breaking sight of the supreme alpha yielding so completely. They had known him as an unbending tyrant, a man who bowed to no god and no king, yet he was now eagerly following the orders of a healer. I slowly walked up the grand, icy stairs toward the massive, imposing iron throne that dominated the far end of the great hall. It was a cruel, ugly seat forged from the melted swords of conquered enemies, a throne that had ruled this frozen continent through terror. It was the very symbol of the alpha supremacy that had originally forced me into a marriage I never wanted in a life I deeply despised. I didn't just sit on the cold, unforgiving metal seat. I intended to completely and fundamentally transform its very nature forever. I pressed my bare, glowing palm against the jagged, ancient iron armrest, closing my eyes and calling upon the deep magic of the earth. I let my raw, untamed life force violently flood the dead, cursed castle, pushing the warmth of the southern sun into the frozen northern stone. Massive, glowing green vines covered in beautiful, silver thorns instantly erupted from the deep cracks in the freezing stone floor beneath my feet. The vines rapidly climbed the towering stone pillars, their aggressive growth violently shattering the frosted windows and letting the true light in. The terrifying, cold iron throne was completely engulfed by a sudden, explosive bloom of magical, vibrant winter roses. The sharp, ugly iron edges were permanently covered in soft, fragrant petals and strong, living wood that pulsed with undeniable life. I sat down heavily on my newly forged throne, my curvy, powerful frame perfectly framed by the beautiful, deadly magic of the resilient earth. The coldness of the castle instantly vanished, completely replaced by the soothing, powerful warmth of my emerald sanctuary magic. I looked down from my elevated seat at the trembling, defeated men who had once treated me as a pathetic, disposable pawn. The outdated, brutal, and suffocating laws of the alpha supremacy end permanently today, I declared, my emerald eyes burning with fire. You will no longer trade women like cattle, you will no longer hoard wealth while the weak freeze, and you will never again rule by fear. My voice echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings, carrying the absolute weight of a decree that could never, ever be undone by any man. From this exact moment forward, the North and the South are permanently united under the absolute healing law of the Emerald Sanctuary. I expected whispers of dissent, I expected a desperate rebellion, but the Great Hall remained absolutely, perfectly silent. They were all looking past me, staring at the man who had slowly, purposefully walked up the marble steps to stand by my side. Dante's golden eyes were filled with a profound, terrifyingly pure devotion that absolutely nothing in this world could ever break. He didn't take the empty space on the platform beside me, proudly refusing to ever claim equal power over the resilient woman who saved him. Instead, the absolute most powerful, lethal, and handsome man in the entire world dropped gracefully to one knee on the top step of the throne. He looked up at me with an expression so incredibly vulnerable and raw that it made the breath catch sharply in my own throat. He gently reached out and took my right hand, his calloused thumb slowly, reverently tracing the glowing silver scar on my palm. He bowed his head, pressing his warm, soft lips deeply and firmly against the magical mark that permanently bound our souls together. My sword, my vast territory, and my entire eternal soul belong exclusively to you, Aliona, he swore loudly, his deep voice unwavering. He intentionally projected his voice, ensuring that every single terrified lord in the citadel heard the absolute finality of his sacred vow. Until the very stars fall from the dark sky and the northern oceans completely freeze over, I am entirely yours to command. This was the same man who had once cruelly whispered that he thought of another woman every single time his lips touched mine. But that arrogant, broken man was entirely dead, completely burned to ash in the devastating, agonizing fires of his own crematorium. The man kneeling before me now saw absolutely no one else in the entire universe but the curvy, powerful queen sitting on the throne of thorns. I gently threaded my trembling, pale fingers through his incredibly soft, short dark hair, feeling a profound wave of peace wash over me. I could feel the incredible, steady, and reassuring warmth of his powerful, beating heart pulsing gently through our shared magical bond. He had completely destroyed the weak, obedient, and terrified girl I used to be on that cold, tragic winter wedding day. But from her bitter, scattered ashes, a completely untouchable, immensely powerful queen had victoriously and beautifully risen. I smiled down at my fiercely devoted, unbelievably handsome protector, finally feeling absolutely safe in a world that had once tried to crush me. I felt deeply loved, completely respected, and utterly free to wield my own magnificent power without ever apologizing for my strength. The bitter, suffocating ashes of the past had finally been washed away by the blood of a true, equal sacrifice and a love that survived the dark. This was exactly how a true, unbreakable legacy began in this harsh world. It did not begin with a forced marriage, a stolen kiss, or a cruel lie whispered in the dark shadows of an ancient cathedral. It began with a single, resilient woman fiercely refusing to ever be a shadow, a substitute, or a victim again. And as Dante looked up at me, his golden eyes shining with unshed tears of absolute joy, I knew my reign would last until the end of time.